Hello, this is Andrew Keogh here. Welcome to Lecture 2 of Digital Games in Contemporary Youth Culture. This one is Game Types and Terminology, where we're going to do, we're trying to cram a fair bit in here in terms of familiarity with game terms, genres, and then look under the bonnet of how games actually come into existence. Instantly, we'll see that there are many problems, quite a number of them semantic, when it comes to achieving this. This quote is quite, it applies across the board just in terms of trying to divulge some sort of semantic meaning or getting, a reductionist or anti-reductionist idea of what a word is and what it means. And when we come to analysing games, we see that words jump all over the shop, and there's any number of disputes as to what is what in game language. So this quote: for a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be thus defined: the meaning of a word is its use in the language. So broadly speaking, we'll take this as the context that the word is used within can be seen to show the significance of that word in any environment. We'll see this with a number of words that seem to jump all over the place, like slippery fish, when it comes to a game analysis. Things that we will expand on in the next lecture to a deeper set. So I just wanted to address that here. So, two words which instantly throw up any number of kind of problematic readings or differences of reading. What is a game and what is play? So, and what is gameplay and where? So we can see just the combination of these words and what they mean in terms of the amount of skills, design, science that is involved in originating a game, and all these things marrying or trying to marry next to a perception of them, or simply a person's experience of something and what would be regarded as a playful environment or a game environment. It's one or two such words that just pop up in that sort of way. We can look further across when we speak of genres, and we see any amount of genre hopping that comes with challenges. The challenge of a game being the operative thing, I suppose, for it to be a challenge. So the playfulness is built into it. Words such as difficulty, just what is difficult. People have different perceptions of this. Indeed, even as far with new technologies, or as Jesper Ewell would talk about, what is real and what is half real. Again, a profound philosophical statement. We'll get at these things in the next lecture, because they are really interesting and do help us expand on a number of readings of games. So we'll go back to our friend Wikipedia for a while here and just get the brass tacks out of the way in terms of the more plastic terms of what we're looking at, or stuff that's historically based and has kind of is well set by now. So a computer game is a computer controlled game. Simple as that. A video game is a computer game where a video display, such as a monitor or television, is the primary feedback device. So as we see, just early consoles, or things that were plugged into reworkings of televisions, being a kind of basis of that, and much like a VCR coming from those types of origins. The phrase interactive entertainment is the formal reference to computer and video games. Fair enough. There we go. A computer game or a PC game is played on a PC. Grant. Console game is played on a device specifically designed for gaming. So that's it. So this is where we have birth of a video game industry, in the obvious sense of a device that needs to be purchased for the game to be played on. And again, here we go. And video game has evolved into the catch-all phrase that encompasses the above, along with any game made for mobile phones, PDAs, and everything else, everything in between. So video game has become quite broad in its application, as we will see, especially true to like virtual realities, augmented realities, any such future kind of, manifestations of it. We'll see that video game becomes quite a loose term. Here's where things get a little bit trickier when we look at something like gameplay and game mechanics. So we'll take these two at their face value from Wikipedia, and we will see that these do jump around a little bit. So the gameplay, to all intents and purposes of a game, would be the tactical aspects of a computer game, such as its plot and the way it's played, as distinct from the graphics and sound effects. So the gameplay is the environment that you are playing within. So you pick a character and you appear in an environment. We'll take an example of like a really simple platform game like Super Mario. You are Mario, you're in a certain land or a certain level, and that is the environment that you're in, and how you move through that level is the gameplay, and what procedural aspects of it would bring you through that. Game mechanics are the physical boundaries on that sort of environment. So it could be the blocks and deciding if something is, a moving platform, if gravity's going to suck you down a hole, if you can go down some holes or you can't. They be the mechanics, and they enhance or restrict the gameplay environment from that. So as we'll see in a little while with some examples, these two terms kind of blend together in a lot of ways, and such seems to be the challenge and the ambition of game designers and game makers to make more interesting environments, is to deliberately kind of blur the lines between what is a gameplay and what is a mechanic, so that the objects making the game become part of the game or part of a game environment. Likewise, the characters can manipulate more and more of the game environment or the boundaries on that game. So again, we'll discuss this further a little bit later in this, with some good examples of that when it comes to say, modding different types of game engine use and environments that are, the new sort of the next kind of iteration of the computer games industry. So likewise, we split hairs here when we see this merge and splitting of game genres. Much like film genres or music genres, it's who knows where this originates from in the simple sense of it. Like if it's something clearly defined by the game, or something that an industry needs to impose on the game. So like they say a platform game, grand, we have platform games. We understand that Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog games like this might be platform games, but they also have other elements in those games as well. Likewise, other games would have a platform element in them, but wouldn't necessarily be described in genre as a platform game. So this is the issue of how this kind of stacks up now. What we do is we're going to take a kind of a breakdown of the more obvious ones, just to kind of give us an introduction to it, and some samples of games that would fall under these brackets or under these headings or genres, just to just kind of give yourselves a snapshot of it. But if you go into something like, say, a Steam and have a look at a type of game, there's any number. There could be 50 plus types of games or different headings or genres that the games are being classified under, or indeed some games would be classified under multiples of genres depending on which side. Like you could have a role-playing game and an MMO game, and they wouldn't, it depends who is defining that as to where it might land. So what we're about to step into, I'll give some examples, but we'll also understand very clearly that and quickly that a lot of these games have multiples in there. So massive multiplayer online games, MMO, MUD, MMO RPG games, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. So these are kind of the newest iteration, or the most successful of late types of games, where they're online, played over the internet, across different countries, all live. Players interact in these environments and they're fully immersive in there. So a good few examples of that would be the World of Warcraft series. EverQuest would be an early one. League of Legends would be another big one, and Ultimate Online, to name a few. But indeed, there's any number of them kind of coming along at any one time, because they're massively appealing and growing at an enormous rate. Simulation games. basically real world environments, or things that wouldn't necessarily be play environments for a game. So this could be like manning a ship, or different cars, or even different world scenarios. So you where the world is believable or has its own logic that plays out, and you interact with that with a really specific set of boundaries and rules. In a serious games environment, they can be used to train professionals or to kind of discuss humanitarian crisis or very serious issues. And the game environment being a way of unpacking a lot of really loaded information, I suppose. So again, we discuss that in its entirety elsewhere, because it's a fascinating area in itself. But in terms of simulations, we'd have games like the Sim series, a football manager game where you simulate managing a team and all that comes with it, as we would have seen in the previous lecture. Kerbal Space Program game where you're simulated in spaceships, and goat simulators where you're literally a goat. So there's any number of those as well. Adventure would be another genre that we could look at. Normally would have spawned from, say, a fantasy world. There'd be a mix of a puzzle environment, a character-based, mission-based environment, and how to figure this out would be the key. So big ones of late would probably be something along the lines of Undertale would have elements of that, but obviously Myst and Zelda, games like this. And then also another side strand of that would be a text-based adventure game, which would have been the original iterations of that. So we look at the likes of Zork and The Hobbit would be other adventure, text-based adventure games. Strategy, real-time strategy games, turn-based strategy, variations on strategy games, normally involve like an inventory of items that you can kind of scroll between. Playing in real time being another sort of game mechanic that just gives it that sort of pressure environment. Can be turn-based. The turn-based games would be closer to like original, games, board games like chess, or different sort of, traditional board games and parlor games, I suppose. A real-time strategy aspect would be more team-based games, where you'd have different players having a different set of characteristics or profiles, or a different role within the game that they have to fulfill. And, communication being a big part of the strategy element of those types of games as well. Solving puzzles, really kind of, things like Tetris, Lemmings, Columns, lately Flow Free, any number of like mobile phone games like this as well. Action games, as fast paced, really reflex driven and kind of fast, and would test people's wits and reflexes against each other and the players. And normally like would have like a level base and different challenges at the end of a level that would need to be kind of played against, I suppose. So also in the simpler sense, we could have an action game that would be like earlier ones, which something like Pong would be described as that, or Space Invaders, where there is that element of reflexes required without the obvious progression through levels, or even the character aspect of it, I suppose. But it's more that sort of using your reflexes quickly and applying yourself opposite either a computer or another player would be the basis of that. So platform games would be a well set genre of, say, would have initially been 2D games, like of Mario and the first character based games to that degree that would have come along. Jumping between surfaces, gravity being a big part of it, having to kind of uncover how to get through a level on a side scrolling game, so it might go from left to right. Obviously went into 3D games when it was reimagined there, so you could see like a multiple of different perspectives on that platform game, and jumping through space would have been a big part of that. Combat fighting games, again, I suppose more the traditional, coming from an arcade setting, I suppose. Games like Street Fighter, Tekken, Mortal Kombat, Streets of Rage, Double Dragon, where there would be these sort of, you would be in this either a one-on-one environment, one versus the computer, where you'd have a selection of characters to pick from who'd all have their own sort of special skills or disciplines, And likewise, you know, going into fighting games like Streets of Rage, where it'd be that side-scrolling aspect and fighting through space from left to right. So like a platform game with fighting components in it. First-person shooters, stealth shooters, more war environment, war-based games with a bit of stealth. Kind of again would hark back to, you know, a strategy, real-time strategy games. So again, you'd have like, say, Counter-Strike would be something that would fall under a couple of headings like that. Using stealth, speed, wits, reflexes, having a whole catchment of different tools that can be used, or, you know, to navigate levels, or weapons that can be used to navigate levels, and using a strategy element in that. Apart from that, just stealth shooter ones where it's literally a shoot 'em up game where you just shoot whatever's right in front of you, which would be kind of the earlier iterations of that. So in terms of games like that, Splinter Cell, Metal Gear Solids, Time Crisis would be big games like that. And then later we'd have the likes of, or in terms of the earlier iterations of those types of games, like Wolfenstein and Doom, and all these kind of coming off the Half-Life and the Half-Life engine, really, which has given birth to all the Counter-Strike games and the likes which have come since. Sports, racing games, yeah, as obvious as that. Games like FIFA, EA Sports, whole series, like, more or less made that company. Not that they stick to that now, but in the first instance, EA would have been like one of the bigger adopters of sports games. Also, racing games, Need for Speed, Gran Turismo, verging on simulation environments really with those games, but, you know, having that kind of player-based side to it as well, where you have to use your reflexes and play by a set of rules in an environment, or control a whole team, would be big parts of that. Role-playing games, normally from a fantasy background, we're playing a character and, you know, advancing through game storylines. Kind of is a descendant of, say, card games like Dungeons and Dragons and the Call of Cthulhu, stuff like this. So you'd have Final Fantasy, Elder Scrolls, Oblivion, Neverwinter Nights. These types of games again fall into a number of categories, be it adventure, MMO, strategy, turn-based. You know, they cross over. And educational games kind of again falls towards simulation, serious games or whatever, but just in terms of like brain teasers, puzzle games, multiple choice testing games, you know, all sorts of different sort of aspects of that, really, that again we'll cover a bit of that in the serious games later on as well. Very quickly, we'll kind of get under the bonnet a bit and see how these game levels are built, and then we'll start looking at the terminology, the words that are used to describe how these are come together.
How does computer memory and level design affect each other? In more ways than you'd imagine. The original NES had 2 kilobytes of RAM, but more could be available in the game's cartridge if necessary. In the NES, a game would store data in the console's RAM, which would then be read and transformed into an image displayed on screen. By selectively storing the right pieces of data, one could draw the level's content for the user to see. In memory, there'd be a value called an offset that would indicate the camera's location within that memory. Increase the offset by 1, and the camera would move 1 pixel to the right. Decrease it, and the camera would move to the left. This reduced the level of processing required to create the illusion of scrolling in a level, since all a game needed to do was copy content into RAM and adjust the offset accordingly. So how does RAM and offsets affect level design? When the first NES games came out, they could do this offset trick, but for only one axis. This means game could only scroll horizontally or vertically, but not both at the same time. Game designers then created numerous techniques to mask this limitation. In Mega Man, when reaching the end of a section, there'd always be a set of letters. The designers placed the letters in a way to hide the fact that the memory's layout just went from horizontal to vertical. Metroid would employ a similar technique where the doors changed the design pace as well, enabling designers to alternate between fully vertical and horizontal levels. What's ironic is that these layouts become so iconic for these franchises that their modern versions still maintain them. Mega Man 10, released in 2010, employed the ladder design, even though the consoles it ran on were thousands of times faster than the NES. The first game to break this mold was Mario 3, since it could have simultaneous horizontal and vertical scrolling. It achieved this via special processing power that came with the game's cartridge. However, the game still faced another type of memory limitation, called palette space. Consoles such as the NES presented color on screen via level of indirection. The video RAM wouldn't actually contain the color of what was actually going to be presented on screen. Instead, it contained what's known as a palette index for each pixel to draw. Think of the palette index as a number the NES used to look up which color to display. So in this example, 1 means red, 2 means blue, and 3 means yellow. The palette then is what's used to convert the numbers into colors. It's a bit complicated to explain why this was done, but in short, it saved a lot of memory, which was scarce and expensive in consoles such as the NES. For comparison, the original Mario game occupied 32 kilobytes of space. Meanwhile, this picture of Mario occupies 221 kilobytes. So although Mario 3 could scroll freely, it still had to do with palettes. The limitation is that only a finite set of colors can fit inside the NES palette, which was usually about 55. Whenever the game wished to display a richer set of colors, that is, the colors that were currently not residing in the palette, it had to swap the contents of the palettes out. But how did it do that? You notice that in several sections of Mario 3, the player goes through a pipe, the screen fades, and once we're back, we're in a completely new environment. What the designers figured out was which enemies, content, and level colors belonged to each palettes and adjusted their layouts accordingly. The pipes acted both as a means to circumvent the NES technical limitation, as well as to imprint an experience of progression into the user. Not only that, some games use the palette swap while the game is still rendering content. Remember how flashy the screen got when you died in Ninja Gaiden? The game is swapping the palette back and forth for the whole screen, creating that effect. This technique was heavily used in numerous games, and it's called palette animation. Well, how about consoles like the PlayStation? How did designers circumvent the limitation of disc-based games? CDs allowed a giant leap in quantity of memory available for games to use, but at a cost. Reading this content was inherently slow because games had to read from the CD and then store that data into RAM. Since this process sometimes took seconds to perform, games now had to deal with load screens. One example of how games addressed that was with Resident Evil. Whenever the player switched rooms, a door would appear over a black screen. An animation would ensue, and then the player would see the new room. Guess what? While the animation of the door opening was ongoing, the game was loading the content from disk for the next room. The door is merely a disguise of the load screen. The black background isn't just aesthetics either. Since it's a uniform color, developers could use this fact to perform various optimization tricks to save memory space behind the scenes. Again, this design element became so famous that modern re-releases of Resident Evil still employ them. As technology evolved, a new technology was developed called Asynchronous File I, also known as streaming. This allowed games to move content in and out of RAM while the game was still ongoing, creating the illusion that the game had loaded more content than it actually did. This meant users didn't see a loading screen if the game was cleverly designed and programmed. God of War did this trick by adding various sections in the game which the player had to literally traverse. As the player progressed, the game got rid of the contents from the previous section and loaded new. This meant level designers had to create level loading areas to embrace this technique. Also, throughout the game, sometimes doors would shut behind the character to halt them from traveling back. That's because the game got rid of a section altogether in RAM, and thus the designers used a simple trick to address that limitation. It's not that they just didn't want the user to traverse back, it's that the content no longer existed altogether in RAM. Nowadays, games such as Skyrim and GTA stream entire worlds as the player traverses them, without the need of using load screens. I hope you enjoyed this video, so let me know your thoughts on this analysis in the comments down below.
Okay, so as we can see from that video, which is really informative, the mixture of game mechanics and gameplay is kind of right there from the offset of like the set of parameters or the problems that are presented to the game designers and the game makers, the boundaries that are in place from the technology they're using. So, you know, things like palette levels, palette animation, level scrolling, and load ups, all these things appearing like parts of the gameplay or parts of the player's choices, but actually being defined by a whole other set of parameters which are closer to the mechanics of putting that game together. Now, as we saw there really quickly from earlier games through to even more advanced ones, with that kind of really key one of the whole size of a Mario game next to like one 3D animated character of Mario, showing how many bytes of information or how many bits of information were needed to put that together. We can see that those things kind of fall away as boundaries on the game. Yet a lot of the choices and the definitions from gameplay grammar or game mechanics in terms of game design understanding of it have kind of held together and become a cornerstone to some extent. This is kind of breaking open somewhat, and I just want to kind of dive. This is just a small diversion into getting under the bonnet of that in terms of the game engines and the power of them that are available for building games now. And then we'll come back to this is basically a key part of where games are and where they're going next. So if we look at, say, something like Steam and Valve and the source code aspect of it, or, you know, a culture of modding that has come along and allowed the player to fully involve themselves in all these different aspects of how you put a game together, be it changing out a sound, changing a skin of a character, taking basically with the likes of Gary's mod, which is the picture here. It has characters from other game environments and kind of bringing them together and blending them all together and mixing it up. And this being something more of a play environment, I suppose, rather than a traditional game as such, or a game with an outcome or with a set of challenges. It's more just, so the term to be applied to this would be like a sandbox game. So as we see all the different aspects of what are components of what it takes to put a game together are now in the hands of the players if they so choose. Another interesting side of this, because it's seemingly liberal and open and liberating and allowing more people to play with games, but there's this term of playbor, like play and labor, being joined together, where we'll talk about it later on in a later lecture when we look at like you know, youth rights and data rights when it comes to like a game environment and the restrictions that are on that. But I just wanted to kind of note that before we go to new game experiences. So the likes of sandbox games, as I've just kind of touched upon, and open world games, things that are seemingly load forever, you know, the likes of the Grand Theft Auto series would be the first games to kind of give that sensation, in one sense, of like, here's a full city and you can go anywhere and do anything in that city. There's a bit of a discrepancy of where a sandbox game ends and an open world game begins. Sandbox, you know, more a physical sandbox, that it's like almost closer to craft, that you can just play with these elements till they get the textures of them. So if we look at a game like Gary's mod, you can play with all different sorts of materials in that and apply certain properties or values to them and see how they interact with each other, and that being like, so almost like a petri dish for play with those game elements rather than a traditional game whatsoever. Open world would be the game environment itself, without the artificial barriers. So what we'll see with this again in a few moments, I want to have some examples to show of that when it comes back to play in a game and our perceptions of what that is, or what is difficult, or what is a challenge, it falls wide open that the technology allows all these things. Some people gravitate towards them and some people gravitate against them, depending on their sort of their interests at any one time of how they look at this and how games should be put together. other types of games or emerging ones, free-to-play games, flash in-app games, advert games. Again, well worth discussing later on somewhere separate, where we see the kind of the casual gamers, or basically games being introduced into non-traditional environments, I suppose, or to people, or to kind of different ways of monetizing a game and presenting it to people, which is, we'll see closer to like, almost gambling in that direction than it is in terms of like, just an honest play environment. Indie games with these sorts of tools and engines and all this sort of computing power in people's hands, where we see a rising number of these, which is kind of the most interesting sort of in terms of the creative aspects of it, where you have these game developers who can do stuff outside of like an industry and outside of a publisher, and kind of have relying on digital distribution and getting them around themselves, but the actual capacity to build a game is much greater and a lot more powerful in an indie game developer's hands than would have been previously the case to some extent, in terms of finding a player or an audience for that game. Virtual reality, augmented reality, towards AI in gaming, really, and again, a fascinating area, fully kind of coming on board, massively at the moment, and we can see, we've a few examples of where that's going to go. Again, to something we'll look at in the next lecture, of something more advanced in that regard. So, what I want to do now is just get under the bonnet once more, and we look at it from a game developer's perspective, really. It's a long video. I'm going to cut it off at a certain point. Greg Kostikian, who's like a veteran of the games industry, just his kind of take on this genre blending, or the perils of a mono form of industry, and where the freedoms and the pitfalls are within the games industry and game design, and how this kind of interacts with players.
So the title of my talk is Natural Game Design, Creating Games Without Cloning. Because in a way, it's hard both from a design perspective and from a business perspective not to do this. From a design perspective, my basic impression of game designers in the industry is that many of them are not exactly secure in their craft, and that, as with young artists of all types, anyone begins by copying what other people do. And unfortunately, the natural tendency from a business perspective is to keep doing that. Because as markets mature, they become increasingly conservative. The cost of development always increases in any new game medium. And as costs increase, business people become much more risk averse, and they try to squish out any possibility of design risk. This is, of course, foolish. Because cloning is fundamentally a mug's game. If you are launching a title into the market that is essentially highly imitative of existing successful products in the market, particularly in a free-to-play environment, you are facing major issues, because the market leader has much better data than you do. They have tuned their game to a fare thee well. They have a higher long-time value than you will at launch, because they have tuned their game to a fare thee well. And you're competing for essentially the same player base, and paying sky-high user acquisition costs because you're in direct competition with the market leader. It's just why anyone does this is beyond me. This is a quote I love. Dan Shirless used to be CEO of Turbine Entertainment. Genre is the name we give to one-hit game and its imitators. That is, this is not true in other fields, but it does seem to be true in the games industry. But the games that create genres, the games that combine and create novel play patterns, tend to be huge hits. Not invariably, like I did not include Doom 2 on my slide here, because although it was highly innovative and created the real-time strategy genre, it itself was not a huge hit. But back into the prehistory, back into the era of tabletop role-playing, Dungeons & Dragons was a game like nothing anyone had ever seen before. So was SimCity, so was Doom, Civilization. And the same thing is kind of true today. A game like Portal, or even Clash of Clans, I'm not saying that any of these games were completely startlingly original, but they combined play patterns in a way that no one had really seen before. So if you look at it from that perspective, innovative design is certainly high risk, but it's also high potential reward. And particularly if, say, you're running a startup, that sounds like a tasty combination of risk and reward to bite off. But as a game designer, the usual things that we do in our day-to-day life do not lend themselves to innovation. We sit around and we twiddle numbers in spreadsheets and we document stuff and we iteratively refine, but we're not doing anything that is kind of blue sky, whole cloth innovation. We are just doing the kind of day-to-day tasks that we're used to doing, and it's important to try to get out of that mindset and do something different. So in preparation for this talk, I was thinking of, what kind of methodologies can we adopt for kind of blue ocean innovation? Are there ways of organizing this process? And I came up with 3 that I have either used myself or that I have observed other people doing. And I'll start with the first one, which is what I call agile design. Now, in the games industry, we pretend that we are doing agile game development. We have stand-ups and we have meetings and we ask people to commit to their tasks and all this kind of thing. But in fact, 90% of the time, what we are doing is we are developing a game to a set budget and a set time frame, and we have a spec that we're asking our engineers to implement. So in fact, what we're doing is waterfall development with a little bit of agile sprinkled on top. But what if we looked at this and we said, let's try to do game design, not engineering, but game design from an agile perspective. And if we do that, what we come up with looks something like this. You take a very small team, 1 designer, 1 engineer, maybe some art support, and you tell them, come up with an interesting core mechanic, and you prototype it and you test it, and if it doesn't work, you throw it out and you start over again, right? You don't stick with something that's not working. But if you prototype it and you look at it and you say, oh, this has some potential, then of course you iterate on it and iterate on it until you get to something and you can say, this is fun, we have found the fun here. And then you go on to stage 2, which is not full-scale development. Because many times I think you will find that once you have that kind of interesting novel core mechanic, you will also discover that the possibility space that it opens up is too constrained to support a full-scale development. So you need to do things like, well, what if we have these power-ups, does that lend itself to the development of 60 different levels? What can we do to kind of complexify our initial core mechanic to create something that actually can support a game that people will want to play for 6 months, or a game that people will want to pay $3 or $20 or $50 for. So you keep on, maybe you scale up a little bit, you have a little bit of a larger team here, have some actual, something other than engineering art. But you keep on iterating that until you can look at it and say, yes, we have the vision, we can see how this can become a blockbuster, and we know exactly what we need to be doing at this point. And that, of course, is when you staff up, you do your planning and pre-production, and you plunge into full development. So the point here is, yeah, you're biting off design risk, but you're doing it with a relatively small team at first, and you're iterating until you get somewhere, and there are some basic rules you need to follow. Tiny team, of course. Also, those first 2 stages, they take as long as they take. You do not time box them, do not constrain them, and particularly be willing to throw away your work if things are not working, and don't gear up until you find the fun. I will say, if it's taking 6 months and your team still hasn't found something interesting, then probably you need a different team, right? But yeah. Okay, so this seems to be kind of how that game company and Spryfox work, both excellent operations. The DOTS people, I think, also kind of work this way. As with any methodology, there are advantages and disadvantages. Firstly, this is likely to work best for mechanically relatively simple games because you're kind of iterating on one core mechanic there. Like just about everything that succeeds in the casual market. Also, of course, there is no guarantee of success, but then nothing guarantees success, ever. Okay, so that was my first approach to coming up with a methodology for innovative game design. This is another one. This is what I call recombinant game design patterns. The idea of design patterns comes out of the architecture world initially, but it has been adopted to software engineering. And a few years ago, Bernd Kleinmeyer came up with the idea of trying to adopt it to game design as opposed to actual engineering. And this is his definition of patterns. Patterns are simply conventions for describing and documenting recurring game design decisions within a given context, be it game design or software engineering. And yes, there is a book, this Patterns in Game Design. This book, from my perspective, should be in every game designer's library. It is incredibly dry and boring. But basically, Staffan Bjork and Jussi Holopainen went out and exhaustively documented essentially all of the game design patterns they could find in both digital and non-digital games. In fact, the book is really only about a third of what their actual work is. The rest comes in a CD-ROM that comes with the book. And if you look at it, essentially a pattern is a collection of mechanics and UI expressions and visual expressions that together make for a kind of building block of a game. Jussi Holopainen, who's one of the co-authors, was my boss when I worked for Nokia. So, games in a genre. If we look at games in a genre, it's astonishing how little they vary. They vary in theme and detail, of course, but in almost every case, every game uses exactly the same play patterns with almost never any deviation. Here's an example. If you look at real-time strategy games, they all have fog of war, they all have resource gathering, they all have building and unit construction, they all have 2 or more races or civilizations or whatever with asymmetric capabilities and different dominant strategies. The early game is a build-up and the end game is a battle, and at least in the multiplayer version of the game, speed and interface mastery is the key to victory. I don't think you can find a real-time strategy game where any of this is not true. So one easy way to innovate is by taking play patterns that haven't been used together before and figuring out how to meld them. Right? Here is an example. Spelunky is an indie game, very successful. It's a platformer, and traditionally, platformers are extraordinarily heavily designed games where the level is carefully planned out and tested to fare well, and there is never any deviation within that level. Spelunky, the levels are algorithmically generated. They're random. So essentially, he's taking Mario Brothers and Rogue and munging them together. And it's amazing that it works at all, and Derek Yu, the developer, had to spend a lot of time tweaking it in order to get it to the point where it really is playable, and you almost never feel, as you do in Rogue, that you're screwed just because of the randomness of the level generation. And of course, one of the advantages is that unlike a game like Mario Brothers, where you play through it and you're done, it has infinite replayability because the levels are different every time. Here's another example. Portal is a first-person shooter, right? Well, no, obviously not. It uses a first-person shooter engine, but really what it is, it's a game of navigation puzzles. So the developers of Portal are taking existing building blocks that we know work for other games. They're taking a first-person shooter engine, they're taking navigation puzzles, they're taking physics, and they're just putting it together in a way that no one had ever seen before and creating something astonishing. Minecraft is another example. There's no element of Minecraft that itself is particularly novel. It's a sandbox world construction game. We've seen that before. It has survival horror elements. We've seen that before. It has crafting. We've seen that before. But we have not seen is the way is putting those together to create this highly novel product. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to any methodology. One of the advantages here is we are starting with proven mechanics. We know that these things work in some context. It may not work in our context, but it's worth maybe experimenting there. And of course, not everything works with everything else. If you took Björk and Holopainen's book and flipped it open and chose 3 mechanics at random, you might look at it and say, this would be a total mess. There's no way I can make a game out of that. On the other hand, you might look at it and say, how would I do that? And you know, that kind of what if is the start of an interesting game design project. This is, of course, less kind of whole cloth innovation than the more agile approach, but probably more suited to more complicated games like, say, the Midcore. My current game, basically, I'm trying to do this, by the way. It's Clash of Clans-like, but no timers, and we're figuring out another way to spin out the gameplay for the necessary amount of time. And actually spin out gameplay in a way that engages players rather than making them twiddle their thumbs for 8 days until their project completes. And the third approach that I've noticed, and in fact use myself, is what I call trope inversion. And the idea here is you take an existing genre that is well understood and well known, and you look at the conventional wisdom behind it, and you say, why does it have to be that way? I'm going to take this one thing and I'm going to totally turn it on its head and do the exact opposite.
Okay, so just to take up on a few points there from the Kostikian video, it's very interesting to see a game designer and developer's perception on these things, and how exasperating seeing the same thing over and over again can appear to people who make these, or once they see it, they can't not see it. What I would call the convergences at play there again, where we can see Kostikian looking to instill a playfulness back into the game design and development and the original sort of the starting points and the fundamentals of a game. Likewise, when he looks at genre, to, you know, dispose of that is a really interesting kind of, you know, slightly glib remark, but also quite true about a one-hit game followed by imitators being a genre. It's still valid. So we're also the other thing of, you know, the linearity of games and, you know, this kind of more straightforward number of mechanics at play, allowing for a more straightforward gameplay being the biggest sort of bane in terms of, like, you know, the game players and game developers alike looking at something as if it's, you know, pretty much boring or something that not to be played. The broader thing underpinning all that from my end is, to my mind, is the design being a vital component, and this being the area where the gameplay and the mechanics come together, and that creating the kind of optimum game environment that you could have. Jumping ahead to the next lecture, I just want to call on the one concept from Csikszentmihalyi, which is a flow, which is kind of applied across the board to game studies and game theory, and this being like as good an indicator of the optimum game environment that you could have, where if the challenge is too much, you know, if it causes too much anxiety, excuse me, where the challenge is too high and the skills are not there available, that's just a frustrating environment which is never going to work in terms of a game. Likewise, on the other side of the spectrum, where we see a low challenge with high skills, we have a pretty much a boring environment that no one's going to hang around and play for too long. And likewise, just in terms of the low end of all those spectrums, where we have pretty low end skills and low to moderate challenge, you're fluctuating between worry and apathy of, like, you know, an engagement in that. None of these things allow for like a really involving game environment. What we're looking at then is something which is a flow buffer, which means we have high challenge and high skills, and the players kept in this kind of frame of the game and frame of mind once they're involved in the game. That's why I hope you've got a chance to play Mini Metro. I didn't want to kind of labor you with too much, you know, in terms of playing hours to put into a game, but I just to give a fast indicator of where the mechanics and the gameplay and mostly the design merged in quite interesting yet different ways. In Mini Metro, it's quite obvious that the graphic design solution to the game has a really enhanced aesthetic quality, is kind of familiar in terms of like tube and underground sort of maps. How little, like how few prompts are in terms of getting an understanding of the controller, like literally one left click and drag being the only sort of prompt that the players needed on screen before getting a handle of the game, and then obviously seeing it grow and morph and become that involving game environment, and then all the indicators from other graphic solutions, be it the geometric shapes, primary colors, or, you know, very vibrant colors, all these things, the understated sound design to just build this game environment, which can become quite sort of intense after a while in a really slow way. Likewise with those sort of the same sound effects, presenting something quite naive and innocent almost on the other side of the spectrum. So that being a, you know, really interesting design solution that shows that merging of the gameplay and the mechanics. Now we're going to kind of delve a little bit further into gameplay principles. I've kind of taken, again, like genre, everything else, this is like just a guide really rather than anything else, but it's a guide from a good hand in Matt Almer, who is like a bit of a veteran of game development and these ends, so it's quite comprehensive in one way, mostly just for things to be aware of. That's my reading of this. So he has laid out in this article 13 basic gameplay principles, where he breaks down the sort of the very simple to the complex mechanics that are needed to be designed, or areas that need to be considered to his mind to allow for like an optimum gameplay and a really functional use of game mechanics to make that gameplay as good as possible. So the first few, to my mind, focal points: anticipation and announced change, more or less like building up some sort of coherence in a game environment. So the focal points simply mean like where the line of sight within a game is, that if it's a Mario game, or where is the sprite that the player is controlling. If they have difficulty finding that instantly is working against the game and making it quite difficult for no particular reason. So it's just bad design if that is the case. Anticipation, literally where the player is in relation to that environment, that what's coming next, or what is getting a sense of immersion of what is within there is close by. So that could be triggered in terms of a soundtrack, sound effect becoming louder as an enemy, or a car or something is close by to give that environment. But mostly that the player knows if they have to interact with that or to just play opposite that they have this awareness and a shorthand of these things that are going on within the game. So announced change, pretty much just to communicate all these changes to the player. This is something that can be really, really simple in one way, of like this set of tasks that are are required to play a game like this. And it's if you have a certain objective to fulfill, that you have fulfilled that, and there's a notification on screen which lets you know that you can move past that. Something as simple as that, where you just get these sort of on-screen notifications that you have completed one aspect of the challenge. The next set he has are more on behavior. And again, this just being, the game logic, making believable game logic in the simplest sense would be my reading of this. But pretty much to just know with the in-game logic where you stand and what is going to happen, and for those things to all combine rather than fall apart. The overlapping of game events and behavior, different sort of status updates, I suppose, or different things where if it's a scoring game, having on-screen dynamics happening all at the same time, so that the player is fully immersed and that becoming a vibrant thing which adds to the gameplay and enhances the whole experience rather than just being procedural. A really, really good example I'll flash up now in a minute is the new game called the Persona series out of Japan, and Persona 5, which is pretty much a turn-based game, but in the form of like this really aesthetically pleasing graphic novel, where you just see all this information, and those sort of preloading screens are updating the next sort of challenge, those becoming a really enhanced part of the game rather than something problematic to overcome. Now, likewise with the physics of the game, within the logic of the game, for these to be, to ensure that is all accurate and is not going to become disjointed. So, that there's no holes in the game essentially, or if there is a hole, that it's the right size hole for a player to go through, or just the relationship between all the game objects and the game mechanic objects is relative, so that it works. Last one being, even though it's a sound design element, but sound itself has been an immersive aspect, can trigger altered states, or just give some sort of indicator of a change to the gameplay, or a change to what is going on, or likewise we said, it just like allowing for a greater heightened anticipation of the player. So a game like, say, Silent Hill would be a really good example of where sound is used to kind of relay all these sorts of things of, creepy monsters and like zombies coming looking for you, So the pacing is another one in terms of just the progression of the game. So pretty much the rate that things occur, the game is considered in its entirety, that you have enough elements there that if there's a high kind of pressured game state, or something that demands a lot of the player, that once that subsides, there's just something on the other side of that which is a little bit more relaxing, or in a different way, before it builds to that again. Likewise, to anticipate that and build that sort of build into something of pace and a bit, something that's going to be a bit more frenetic, and just kind of aware of all those things, so you're not just bombarding the senses of the player, but likewise so they're not totally bored with what's going on either. The environment, simple as the spacing of the environment. So just to make sure that there's enough things in the game or in any sort of level or game environment. It'd be a case of, you know, making sure that you're not getting lost down alleys, or again, pretty much like we just discussed with the physics of a game, to make sure that it actually works and the player can continue along a certain path if that's what's meant to happen. Linear design, component breakdown. So the linear design is just pretty much about what involves the solving of the challenge, so the next immediate challenge that needs to be solved, which can allow for kind of more basic gameplay, but also it's so say puzzle games would be built off that, where everything is like the next iteration or built slowly like that. The component breakdown does have an element of that again, but it's inside something bigger, and to make sure that all those things kind of work in harmony to deliver certain sort of aspects of the game at any one time. And it's pretty much for the designers to have that sort of template laid out, like, so when we have the components, they got, you know, parts of the game can go on different tangents or go on different sort of stories basically, but everything's referring back to the whole, and there's no getting lost down one particular branch of the story. So that would come in, that last one, the component breakdown, would just pretty much come in terms of like level design and the overall system design, are those sort of key things in terms of considering the whole environment rather than trying to fix it afterwards. So the last ones, which he would refer to as being the foundations, which are kind of pretty straightforward, is just like, how does the player factor into all this, which, you know, everything is about that game environment and that experience and making sure that it works. So that's the vital thing, making sure that, you know, it's fully immersive. The gameplay allows for that flow, if we want to use that word for now, and can just kind of have everything kind of moving along at a certain at an optimum level as the game demands, and to enhance the game experience. The communication aspect is literally about how a team would work to create the objectives of the game correctly. So how the elements of the environment, how you're communicating that, and how the elements of the environment are allowing for the player to kind of go on a certain path and into that journey that it is. So even in terms of an open world game, if you do have some things that look more appealing than others, this is something that's going to is going to influence the player's decision making within a game. And last but not least, we look at the appeal of the whole game. So it's a case of what can be done to make that as massively appealing as possible, and not fall into what Kostikian would call a genre of one-hit game followed by a lot of imitators. I've just a couple of videos to kind of point out how on its head this kind of the gameplay versus the game mechanics, and the game designer and developer versus the player is kind of overlapping and interweaving. And I have a couple of examples to use of this before we finish off. I want to pick on the game No Man's Sky, which was released last year. It's pretty much a space travel trade game. A player can traverse around whole universes, land on planets, and set up whatever way they want, be it like selecting objects off that planet, harvesting them, trading them with other people, some minor battle elements, but pretty much it was like an exploration game. And something in terms of the design of the game design and the mechanics of it, where it was built procedurally so that it is essentially an endless environment. I want to just kind of use two aspects of that, of where it came out with that sort of phenomenal side of it, next to a lot of the reviews that would have come back on the back of it. So we just watched the trailer for the original gameplay, and then I'll pick up on that again. So as fascinating as that game looks, graphics and just the sheer scale of that environment for being able to traverse a universe, and the aspects of being able to mod. There is some version of battling in the game, or challenges like that. But the main criticism to come back was it was just very difficult to bump into people for any of these things to happen. And the overarching kind of criticism then being there's nothing to do. So it's kind of, I just wanted to present that as a new extreme of the technology so outstripping the imagination that the environment, a universe can be built, and people wouldn't be happy because there's no game challenge in there. So I just want to move on to talking about the first update of the game to come out, which is the Foundation. I'll show you a couple of minutes of the updates for the game that were provided with that issue, and then really quickly just show a really short video of another game, it's the Grand Theft Auto series, San Andreas, and a kind of an art piece where it was hacked out, and it was streamed live on Twitch, called the San Andreas Deer Cam. And I just wanted to kind of show that as another counterpoint of the hacked, modded, becoming the playful part in the open world game environment on the other side. So where there is boundaries and people are trying to make it kind of, a bit more intriguing or stranger, and look, generating gameplay from the other side of it, next to the no man's land where you have this environment and you can do anything, but you want rules. So there's just kind of to my mind, there's a bit of an interesting comparison there of the two extremes of the idea of gameplay and the game mechanics, and again, the idea of the player and the game designer kind of becoming muddier parts really, and technology being the main drive on that. So I'm just going to show you those videos really quick and then come back to close off, because I know I'm going over the hour-long lecture time. Okay?
Welcome to No Man's Sky, version 1.1, the Foundation update. Returning explorers can now choose their own path to experience the infinite universe. Normal mode is the original relaxed voyage, whilst creative allows exploration and creation freely and without limits. A new survival experience will test travelers' endurance to their limits. Explorers can now deploy equipment in the field. Save points can be built from resources at any time and are crucial in survival mode. Use of automated mining harvesters is recommended to gather resources, together with waypoints to permanently mark points of interest. Biome and star-specific resources have been introduced, along with planets devoid entirely of life and constructs. User interface improvements include an intelligent quick access menu, which streamlines inventory access. Products can be stacked, allowing for increased cargo size. Revisions to terrain algorithms create more aesthetically interesting planets. Travelers can claim a home planet and architect an outpost at uninhabited bases found on terrain surfaces. Bases offer shelter from hazardous environments and allow explorers to put their mark on the universe in creative ways. Plants grow over time, meaning biome-dependent crops can be cultivated outdoors or inside hydroponic labs. Alien life forms are available for recruitment in orbital space stations. Farming, weapon, scientist, and engineering specialists are available to hire and will help research new discoveries. Simple, intuitive controls allow functional constructs to be erected and decorated in moments, replicated from gathered resources. Quick travel between a space station and home planet can be performed at any time using a terminus teleporter. Interstellar freighters can be purchased at great expense and summoned from anywhere in the galaxy. These expand travelers' reserves, supporting resource teleportation from on-planet and optimize inventory management. Planets can be scanned for resources from space, and the current mission objective can be viewed at any time. Motion blur accentuates the feeling of speed, especially when traveling through space.
What in the fucking world is that? Just here, keep the original company old-fashioned way.
This shit's fucked up.
Man, are you blind or something, motherfucker? I'm finna put you the fuck out the game.
That shit ain't right, man.
Why would it?
Yeah, anyone interested in looking at San Andreas Deer Cam, there is hours of it online, and it's kind of fascinating to see how the mundane aspects of such a kind of experiment, or an art piece, I suppose you want to call it, kind of shows the real richness of those games and the design and all the different mechanics and background elements, and seeing this sort of open world scenario. As regards No Man's World, who knows where that's going to end up? Where you can kind of talk, you could essentially say that we've gone to the furthest extremes of being able to build and simulate a universe, and a player in a game environment not being happy with that. But the bottom line being, the parameters are being drawn by the players, and the game environment is now something much more organic and interchangeable there. So that pretty much wraps up this lecture. For the next one, we'll just kind of step a little bit further into that in terms of the kind of game theory and looking at the main sort of key influences to that, and how to actually analyze a game from that sort of a depth. So we'll be looking at a lot of the theorists. Yeah, that's it. Have a good week. Talk to you next week.